Hello to all of you dear people all around the world. Welcome to episode number 32 of the Elixir of Awareness channel. The interesting topic of this episode is about the conversation inside our minds that we all have experienced. A voice that seems to be always and everywhere with us, and we're used to hearing it. But maybe we never thought about it seriously. Our main source in this episode is a book titled Chatter: The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters, and How to Harness It by Dr. Ethan Kross. So stay with us.
Don't forget to like and click the subscribe button for more weekly updates on mental health and self-development. Thank you.
In one sentence, the main idea of the book is about our most important conversation, which is our inner conversation with ourselves. This conversation has a great impact on our destiny because our thinking and our definition of our identity and others and the world depend on this inner conversation. The author of the book is a psychologist who graduated from Columbia University and is also the founder of the Emotional Psychology Laboratory at the University of Michigan. This book is full of various valid scientific researches, and Dr. Ethan Kross has insisted a lot that what he says be valid in the framework of a university study. We all know how important introspection is. It means that we become alone with ourselves and know ourselves and explore the roots of our wounds and behaviors so that we can know the world through knowing ourselves. And this is the most important door in life. But unfortunately, mostly times we can't open this door. Because as soon as we're alone with ourselves for a few moments and we try to explore ourselves a little, we suddenly encounter an annoying inner voice that's a cruel and sometimes annoying critic. That's why the most important door in our life, which is towards us, remains closed. Because of the voice of an annoying inner critic. We've all heard this famous quote that says, "Always listen to your inner voice." But Dr. Ethan believes that many times this voice is an annoying voice, and that's why many people can't do introspection. But what's this sound? As we said, this voice is very effective in determining our destiny. A voice that maybe we rarely think about and don't pay attention to. But why is this voice so important? Because our entire thinking process takes place during an internal conversation. Let's think about your thought process for a moment, because thinking about thinking process is a very interesting thing. It's as if we're having an internal conversation with an extraterrestrial character. And in fact, it's in the process of this conversation that we examine and evaluate different things and then make decisions and react. In fact, we think with the help of this voice, and that's why the presence of this voice in our mind is so effective. So it's important to know this voice and know where it came from that we will talk about on the continue. And it's important to know that when and where can be destructive and disturb the thinking process. And at the very end, it's important to know how to face it so that we can think better.
Don't forget to like and click the subscribe button for more weekly updates on mental health and self-development. Thank you.
This sound usually either throws us into the past or sends us to the future. The human mind isn't present in the here and now in many times of life, and one of the reasons is this inner voice. Our mind is like a time machine. We constantly move in different times. For example, one moment we're in a childhood memory, the next moment we're anxious for an imaginary situation in the future, and we return to the present moment again. And this is a very complex and amazing process. Of course, Dr. Ethan Kross explains that all the research done on this topic is very new. This means that our understanding of this voice isn't yet complete and many additional researches are being done. But everything we know so far about this inner voice can be an excellent guide. Hannah Arendt says that the mind is from this world, but often it doesn't live in this world, and it can be said that this is one of the harms of this voice that separates us from the direct touch of life. For example, Dr. Ethan Kross explains that when we've a verbal argument with a person, and then we're alone for a few minutes, this inner voice is so loud that it occupies all the capacity of the mind and takes away our permission to think. It must have happened to you that after an argument with a close person, you couldn't even read a line of a book. This is because the entire capacity of your mind is occupied by that voice. An amazing fact is that sometimes we talk to ourselves up to 4,000 words per minute in this situation, even if we don't realize it consciously. Yes, this is a very large number, and sometimes most of these words are annoying words that can block our way of thinking. But another important question is, why do we have this inner voice? And what's the use of this sound? The answer is that because our whole thinking process is done with this sound, then our survival and our humanness and our identity depend on this inner voice. For example, Dr. Ethan Kross believes that we've a mechanism in our mind called active memory. Active memory means that we're reconstructing and retrieving information in the present time. This means that memory isn't something like the land of the past that we can request something from there. Rather, at every moment, this past seems to be present, and in order for us to do our daily tasks, we need a series of fundamental information from the past, which is constantly processed in our minds, and in the form of which the inner voice is reflected, so the living will be possible. Here is a very important question: where does this sound come from, and where's it formed? The point that Mr. Dr. Ethan Kross points out is that we aren't born with this voice, and in fact, children notice this inner voice from a certain age and go along with it. But before this inner voice is accompanied with children, they talk loudly to themselves. You must have seen children who talk to an imaginary friend, or even a toy at a certain age. They whisper interestingly. For example, they may argue themselves sometimes or guide themselves sometimes. But it's very important that if you listen carefully to their voices, as researchers prove, we can recognize our own voices as parents in that imaginary conversation of our children. That is, if we listen well, we will hear all the details of how we talk and communicate with others and ourselves in the form of our child's conversations with an imaginary character. Over time, when the child grows older, this conversation changes from the external state to the internal state, and forever this voice will remain as an internal conversation and forms their entire thinking process. Dr. Eric Berne divides personality into 3 different parts in his book called Transactional Analysis in Psychotherapy: child, adult, and parent. And he believes that it's the voice of the parents that becomes a part of our personality in childhood and then will create our thinking process as an inner voice. The same voice that constantly emphasizes the norms to us sometimes praises us, and sometimes blames us, and sometimes guides us and gives us different suggestions. As we said, this voice is our inner nagging critic. Now ask yourself if you knew that what you say to your children will forever be playing in their mind like a music and completely will affect their thinking process. Then what would you say to them? How would you talk to them? And how would you guide them? And how would you describe them? This is a very important question, so know that our voice will be with our children all their life. Even if you don't have children yourself, you can give this important advice to people close to you who've children so that they also understand how effective their relationship with their child is.
Don't forget to like and click the subscribe button for more weekly updates on mental health and self-development. Thank you.
This voice also helps you create your identity. If you think about the question of who am I, you'll see that we remember and know ourselves with a story. Something like a short movie or a short story, and this story is created and directed by this inner voice. To better understand how important this sound is, think about what'll happen if this sound disappears in our mind. There were some people who experienced this situation because of a series of neurological disorders. One of these people is a woman who's also a researcher in the field of the brain, named Mrs. Jill Bolte Taylor. Also, she tells this story in full in a TED Talk B show, which we recommend you watch if you get the chance. Her story is that she wakes up on a normal day to start exercising like any other day, but in the middle of the exercise she realizes that her thinking process is changing. She guesses that maybe she isn't fully awake yet. But the problem was something else. A small vessel was torn in the left hemisphere of her brain, and in fact, a slight hemorrhage had occurred in her brain. The left hemisphere is where the language control center is in the brain. It means where the speech process takes place, and it can be said that this inner voice is also related to the left hemisphere of the brain. The strange thing is that over time, she feels that she's losing her sense of identity, and she slowly doesn't know who and where she is. It's as if she gradually finds herself in a world that she doesn't know what she's to do with it, and basically she doesn't know who's experiencing this world, and this is a very surreal and strange experience. With the increase of bleeding in the left hemisphere, her speech power is gradually impaired, and as a result, the boundaries between her and the world gradually fade. It's as if the outside world leaks into her body, and a deep delusion covers her entire existence. After she realizes that she isn't feeling well, she barely gets to the phone and calls her colleague with the last bits of her being, and her colleague realizes that she's in serious trouble. Then an ambulance comes, and she's taken to the hospital. An interesting point is that this person has a unique experience related to her inner voice from the time of the accident to the first surgery, which takes about 2 weeks, and then to her complete recovery, which takes about 8 years. For example, because that voice was silenced inside her and absolute silence covered her mind, she was no longer a mental traveler like us normal people. That is, her mind no longer traveled to the past, future, and present, and her mind didn't remember the narrative that she'd created about her for 4 decades. And the important point is that she'd a double feeling in this happen. A part of her being was extremely terrified because of the experience of this incident and this absolute mental silence. And, of course, another part of her being was happily immersed in this absolute peace. Because of this incident, MS, Jill Bolt Taylor had the opportunity to get rid of that annoying inner voice for a while and experience a pure connection with the world. She later explains that after this unique experience, she concludes that it's very, very important to pay attention to how we talk to ourselves. This is the advice of a person who's experienced the absence of this inner voice for a while and has spent her whole life talking about this experience with people and conveying her experiences to them on how to have a healthier relationship with this voice. But how to control this voice? As we said, this voice makes it possible to live and think, but sometimes it can be very annoying. And it's better to think for a moment what harm this voice can do to us in its destructive form. The author of the book, Dr. Ethan Kross, has done an interesting research. He brings together the people whom their inner voice annoyed them so much. For example, people who were in mourning or failed in an emotional relationship or were in a very stressful situation. Then he and his colleagues take X-ray photos of their brains, and something interesting is noticed. They realize that exactly the same circuits have been activated in their minds that are activated during physical pain. That is, we conclude that when we experience an emotional and mental pain, the experience of our brain is completely similar to a physical pain. But why is this point important? Because we're unaware of the destructive effect of this inner voice, while it can be worse than physical pain. For example, when your tooth hurts, the severity of the pain definitely disturbs everything of you. But anyway, you know the reason for this pain. In this situation, you definitely know the solution to get rid of the pain, so you go to the dentist. But when we've a mental pain that you don't pay attention to, it leaves the same impact as physical pain in our body, while we don't even know the reason. The pain that covers our entire consciousness like a hidden poisonous cloud, while even we've no idea how to fix it. So look at how painful mental pains can be without realizing it. Listen to this beautiful quote. The sadness that doesn't find a way to cry forces other organs to cry. So when this inner voice reaches its peak, it affects our other organs as well. For example, the body remains in a constant state of threat, or a series of psychosomatic illness occurs to us. These are all signs that show something is wrong inside us.
Don't forget to like and click the subscribe button for more weekly updates on mental health and self-development. Thank you.
But an important question is, why does this voice sometimes become destructive? The answer is in the environment. Dr. Ethan Kross gives a simple formula that makes a lot of sense. He believes that a gene plus the environment is equal to who we're. Genes make us in interaction with the environment. But the point is that new studies show that the effect of this environment is very, very important. We see the effect of the environment in the genes because the genes react and change over time under the influence of our genetic accumulation and the environmental information that our parents and our ancestors lived for centuries. For example, Inuits live in snowy environments, where the reflection of light in the snow is annoying for the eyes, so genes have changed the structure of their eyes to absorb less light. This was an interesting example of how the environment affects us through genetic accumulation. It's interesting to know when we enter this world we've a series of genetic accumulations of our ancestors, but it's the environment that determines which genes are activated and which aren't. Dr. Ethan Kross believes that genes are like piano keys that exist in us, and there are notes ready to be played. But the environment is like a pianist who can choose and play the notes based on its desire. It can be said that the root of this voice is the environment in which we grew up. So a simple way to recognize, control, and face this voice is to think about the environment in which we grew up. Let's think about where and how we found ourselves, and in what educational system we grew up. That the environment reflected in our existence like a constantly repeating cycle. This is the most important step to face this voice. In the following, Dr. Ethan Kross presents a series of more practical solutions to control and deal with this voice. But if we want to tell you the summary of all these solutions, we must say that you should think about learning that the world is always bigger than the size of your skull. This way of thinking will help us to be freed from the prison of our mind. Maybe all these solutions that we presented can't completely and accurately solve this problem, because, as we said, this voice has been institutionalized in US since childhood. But remember, even this small efforts to control this voice can be very important and comforting. Because we humans sometimes find ourselves in situations where the situation becomes so difficult and uncontrollable, and the storm of suffering becomes so intense that even if we can reduce a bit of this suffering, that amount is very important and valuable. So don't just look at the simplicity of these solutions. Think that when we're at the peak of absolute despair, maybe this amount of small efforts can make life brighter and save us. Even if these solutions are a bit healing, they're enough for us, and they aren't going to solve the entire problem completely and forever. Following these practical recommendations, Dr. Ethan Kross recommends standing a little further away. Research shows that the more sensitive people are to details, the more annoying their inner voice is. If you zoom 100 times on a beautiful painting, you probably won't understand the beauty of that painting. And if you focus too much on minor details, you'll be involved in tragedy. But on the other hand, there are people who see life from a long-shot point of view. And of course, they also can't understand all the beauty of life because they completely separate themselves from the details. Dr. Ethan Kross recommends that the best method is to use medium shot, while occasionally switching between close-up and long shot. But know that the closer you get to a topic, the topics will become more personal to you. As a result, the inner voice of your mind will become more active and you'll suffer more. Suffering is a part of wisdom. And the more you understand the details, the more you'll suffer, and this is a bitter truth. We just have to accept it. But the good news is that the mind is flexible, and if we know how to bend it, we can learn how to distance ourselves from events. So we've to get used to stand a little distance in critical situations and stand further away from problems. Dr. Ethan Kross believes that we have two types of personalities. Some people who are mostly introverts are immersings, and others who are mostly extroverts are distance takers. Immersings pay more attention to details and the environment in normal conditions, and this is an excellent feature. For example, immersing people are more influenced by nature, and they understand the messages of the environment better and generally enjoy the beauty more than distance taker people. But this characteristic of them, which is their strength point in normal conditions, may be detrimental to them in critical conditions. Here, distance takers, who are less affected by details, perform better in crisis situations. But why? Because they're less affected emotionally in crisis situations. As a result, they can react more logically.
Don't forget to like and click the subscribe button for more weekly updates on mental health and self-development. Thank you.
Dr. Ethan Kross uses an example. He says that sometimes, during a crisis, try to see yourself from the perspective of a fly on the wall. That is, reduce the zoom a little and try to distance yourself from that crisis. Researchers prove that those who are able to distance themselves a little from the crisis, even their cardiovascular system, the reaction against stress, and also their mental destructive emotions are reduced to a very significant extent. Daniel Kahneman, who wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow and has worked on brain function for almost half a century, has an interesting sentence. He says that one of the most valuable experiences of my life has been that I gradually learned how to strengthen the external vision in myself. But another practical solution to get rid of the inner voice is that sometimes in crisis situations, changing the reference pronoun can be a lifesaver. Have you ever noticed that when you're telling someone a bitter memory, usually when you reach the bitterest moment of the story, you change the reference pronoun from me to you. For example, when someone has done something unpleasant with you, and you're telling the story to your friend, for example, you suddenly unconsciously say, "Can you imagine how hard it's to not be appreciated of you after a few years of hard work?" Do you see? Here the pronoun changed from me to you, while this has happened unconsciously. Or, for example, did you pay attention to your inner voice that it seems it calls you with first pronoun? And the author believes that this is a good and helpful mechanism. It's interesting to know that Henry Adams, whose autobiography won the Pulitzer Prize, wrote his biography using the third-person pronoun. In fact, this technique can help to distance oneself from ego and mental prejudices. Another study shows that those who comment on the Meta social network using the first-person pronoun are more prone to depression. So, if you're going to write, it's better to use a pronoun other than the first-person pronoun. This will help you see your story more clearly and realistically. Sometimes friendly conversations can calm the mind. But how? Expressing your feelings and turning this inner voice into an external voice can definitely help. But Dr. Ethan Kross believes that there's a trap in this process, and that trap is staying in the emotional drain stage. It means that sometimes we tell something to someone but not with the intention of healing or finding a solution. In fact, this trap is endless talking. Sometimes we find someone for our heart touches, but because the child inside us likes to play the old role of a victim, this conversation will be fruitless, and this conversation may continue just to get attention and pity. So know that this isn't helpful at all. And a conversation with another person should be accompanied by receiving solutions from the other side, besides receiving attention. We shouldn't remain in the role of a victim. A good conversation is both comforting and wise, and the most effective conversations meet both needs. And the important thing is that it's important to be heard first, and then it's important to help and provide practical solutions from the other person. Dr. Ethan Kross believes that a good conversation has several stages. First, listening. Second, empathy and standing next to the other party. Third, agreement. And fourth, influencing and finally changing behavior. The important thing is, please don't just go to people who approve of you for friendly talking, because usually you never learn anything new from someone who always agrees with you. Just think about whether the people you talk with will drown you in your problem or help you to get away from the crisis. Don't forget that the answer is usually found in the person's own words, and if we listen carefully, we can find the answers for many of the person's questions in their words. Research shows that the external environment in which we're located has a direct effect on our internal conversation. In a study conducted on 900,000 children, they found that if a child's exposure to nature is low, the risk of developing mental disorders such as depression and anxiety in adulthood increases by 15 to 55%. So we know that communication with nature is very important. But why does this voice in our mind calm down and become silent when we're in nature? Because nature makes us feel startled, the feeling of shrinking ego. For example, when you look at a mountain where there are millions of lives, including colonies of different insects or different plant species or different animals, we conclude that we aren't the center of the world. For this reason, the ego calms down a bit, and a calmer ego produces a less inner voice. The feeling of startling means a feeling mixed with surprise and fear when I see a huge phenomenon that can hardly be described. It's like watching a volcano erupt or watching a big waterfall. Along with nature, sometimes you can experience also this feeling with art. For example, reading an excellent novel, or even watching a good movie, or looking at an amazing painting. All these can help us to distance ourselves from our ego for a moment, so that we can calm down our inner voice. It's interesting to know that when the external environment is regular, it makes the voice inside our mind calm down a bit. For example, Rafael Nadal, the world-famous tennis player, is heavily involved in this inner mental conversation. He says that in every match, the main competitor I'm fighting with is in my mind. It's interesting to know that Nadal has a mild and weak form of OCD. For example, before each match, he places his ID card on the bench at a certain angle, or folds his towel in an orderly manner, or, for example, places mineral waters at a certain distance from the bench. In psychology, what Nadal does is called compensatory control. Compensatory control means compensating for disorder in one area by compensating for disorder in another area. It means exactly what Rafael Nadal does. So it's very important when our mind is disturbed to be able to put some order in the external environment in order to calm down our mind. As we said, these solutions are simple but practical, so don't take them for granted and use them because they can be very helpful and decisive. But please don't overdo it because it may lead to obsessive-compulsive disorder. Dr. Ethan Kross talks about the strong influence of the power of indoctrinate on the human mind, about how our belief in the positive effect of something can actually affect our body and mind. Sometimes many rituals aren't truth, but they can be true. For example, an Australian Olympic swimmer named Stephanie Rice rotates her hands 8 times before each competition, presses her swimming goggles 4 times and touches her head 4 times. And this makes him focus and relax before the match. But these things definitely don't have a special effect in reality, but because the person himself believes in doing these things, it can have an effect on his calmness and concentration, motivation, and finally on his performance. The great writer Joseph Campbell also believed that in the past there were rituals that helped people to get through the difficult stages of their lives. These rituals were a link between the person and something bigger than itself. For example, a group of Indians said this sentence every day when they woke up: "What a glorious day to die." And this simple sentence was making that day to be spent in the best possible way and be glorious. In fact, they believed that if today is the last day of my life, then it must be a glorious day. And what a beautiful belief. Well, we hope that the subject of this episode of the Elixir of Awareness channel has been of interest to you. In the end, let's not forget that the biggest achievement that controlling this annoying inner voice can have for us is the opportunity to meet ourselves. Because sometimes the only thing that delays this meeting is the inner voice of our mind that we've been living with for years. So if we can control this voice just a little, then it will open a big door and we can meet ourselves at the behind of that door. Our final question of this episode to you is, how is your relationship with this inner voice? Have you ever paid attention to it? Will you think about it more from now on? What's your experience? Thank you very much for being with us until the end.